This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahon, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Innistrad Crimson Vow. So far, I've covered all the multicolored, colorless, white, and blue cards, and today we're taking a look at black. A few quick caveats before we get to our first card. Keep in mind I'm only talking about limited, I'm not talking about other formats or any cards that don't appear in draft boosters for this set. Also, these are my initial thoughts about the format before playing with the cards. I will put out videos with my updated thoughts on these cards over the next several weeks in a weekly vlog series I do called Nitsa Notes that comes out every Saturday. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to help sum up my thoughts on each of these cards. If you don't know what those letter grades mean, there's an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first black card. Next up, it's Aim for the Head, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says choose one, exile target zombie, or target opponent exiles 2 cards from their hand. It seems like we get a new take on Mind Rot every set, and this one's pretty interesting. 3 mana to get rid of 2 of your opponent's cards is of course a 2-for-1, but the problem with Mind Rots is that they don't impact the board, and that can be a real cost, and they also have an effect that diminishes as the game goes on. It is a big deal that this exiles the cards, though, because of the graveyard stuff in this format, and the alternate mode, where it's a zombie removal spell, also makes it much better. That's not to say this card is good or anything. It has 2 kind of narrow effects, and that, I think, means that you can main deck it if you really need to. It's probably like a C-. I mean, Mind Rot is usually about a D+, and I think the upside of being able to exile zombies is enough to get it to C-. Next up, it's School of Thraben, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 zombie cleric at uncommon, and when it or another zombie you control dies, look at the top card of your library. If it's a zombie, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put the card into your hand, you may put it into your graveyard. Here's a nice one to hit with Aim for the Head. Anyway, this looks nice enough. At worst, it's a 3 mana 3/2 that surveils 1 when it dies, and that's like a C, and this has way more upside than that if you have a bunch of other zombies. Black decks will basically always have a few zombies, and blue-black decks will have more than a few, and in those decks, it can turn into a real card advantage engine. I think I see this being a B- just because it has such a reasonable floor and such an impressive ceiling. Next up, it's Bleed Dry, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common instant. It says target creature gets -13/-13 until end of turn. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead. This is pretty much unconditional removal, and exiling the thing you kill is a real bonus. This is premium removal for sure, and maybe black's best common. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Blood Fountain, which for 1 black mana is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you create a blood token. We're going to see a lot of these in this video. Blood tokens are artifacts that you can pay 1 mana and sacrifice and discard a card to draw a card. And it has another ability too. You can pay 3 generic and a black and sacrifice it to return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. I always like having 1 copy of the black card that gets you 2 creatures back from the graveyard, and that's what this is. For 5 mana, you get those 2 creatures and a blood token, and that's a pretty reasonable rate, especially because you're paying it in 2 installments, and you can actually pay the larger part at instant speed. Usually when we see these cards that give us stuff back from our graveyard, we have to cast them on our own turn because they're sorceries, and this isn't. You don't normally want to overdo it with copies of this kind of card because they tend to not be so good early, but this offsets that a little bit since it does give you blood before the other part of the card becomes useful, and there are lots of blood synergies in the set. But yeah, getting 2 creatures back late can often give you what you need to win the game. I think the first copy of this should be valued as a C+, with diminishing returns for other copies. Next up, it's Blood Crazed Socialite, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 vampire at common with menace. When it enters the battlefield, you create a blood token, and when it attacks, you can sacrifice a blood token, and if you do, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. A 4 mana 3/3 with menace isn't amazing. It's probably a C-. However, this brings a lot of extra value. First, it gives you a blood token, and I think I'd already be playing that card a reasonable chunk of the time. It'd be like a C. But it also has the massive upside of making itself into a 5/5 when it attacks, provided you have blood. And because the Socialite brings a blood token with it, you'll get to do that at least once. And if you have more blood, this can be attacking as a 5/5 numerous times throughout the game, and that's pretty great. I'm giving this a B-. It's a very good common. Next up, it's Bloodsworn Squire, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 vampire soldier at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and a black and discard a card, and it gains indestructible until end of turn, and you tap it. Then if there are 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you transform it into Bloodsworn Knight, a star vampire knight, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and it has the same ability. You can pay 1 generic and a black and discard a card to give it indestructible until end of turn and tap it. So the front side of this card would be a kind of decent card already, as being able to threaten indestructibility is a pretty big deal, and makes it hard for your opponent to interact with it. Having to pay 2 mana and discard a card is a real cost though. Transforming this won't be the easiest thing in the world either, especially because a lot of the time holding onto a creature in your hand will be worth way more than using this thing's ability and trying to transform it. However, by the late game, it is likely to transform and be a pretty decent size while still having that indestructible ability. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Blood Vial Purveyor, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 5/6 vampire at rare. It's got flying and trample, and when an opponent casts a spell, they create a blood token, and when it attacks, it gets +1/+0 for each blood token defending player controls until end of turn. It doesn't say it on the card, but it is supposed to say that. They've already issued an erratum for it. So, giving your opponent a blood every turn is certainly a downside, but one I'm willing to live with when I get a 4-mana 5/6 with trample and flying that hits harder the more blood your opponent has. Don't get me wrong, blood is certainly something your opponent can use to improve their card quality, and if they have some blood synergies, it might be particularly painful to give them those blood tokens. But if they don't have synergies, to get value out of them, they're going to have to pay mana and discard cards to it, so it isn't like you're giving them straight up free cards, you're giving them card selection. And overall, I think I'm willing to give that up for a creature that's this big in the sky and that can win the game pretty quickly. The downside obviously keeps it from ever approaching bomb range, but I do think it's a B. Next up, it's Catapult Fodder, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/5 zombie at uncommon, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control 3 or more creatures that each have toughness greater than their power, transform Catapult Fodder, and then it becomes Catapult Captain, a zombie that's a 2/6, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and tap it and sacrifice another creature, and target opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. A 3-mana 1/5 is actually kind of a reasonable defensive creature. It can really hold back X1s, and it can block other things for a pretty long time, and defensive creatures are especially welcome in the black-green color pair, which has toughness payoffs, like this card, which will transform once you have enough creatures with higher toughness than power, and once it does, it can start loading their bodies into catapults and launching them at your opponent's face, which could be particularly exciting with a 13 toughness creature at common that we're going to see later in this video. The 1/5 helps you find time to get there too. Outside of the black-green deck, this won't be very good. It'll be harder to transform, and you won't really be able to get the payoff out of the card. I do think it's going to be a nice card for that color pair specifically, kind of decent everywhere else. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cemetery Desecrator, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 zombie at Mythic Rare with Menace. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you exile another card from a graveyard, and when you do, you have 2 choices. You can remove X counters from target permanent, where X is the mana value of the exiled card, or you can have target creature and opponent controls get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the mana value of the exiled card. This is incredibly powerful. It will frequently be a 6-mana 4/4 with Menace that kills a thing when it enters the battlefield, and then does it again if it dies, and that's really strong. Because you can exile any card from either graveyard, you're likely to be able to take down a whole lot of creatures with both triggers. This will usually end up giving you a 3-for-1. The counter side of things will come up very rarely, but, sometimes maybe you do it. Either way, this is a crazy bomb. I'm giving it an A+. Next up, it's Concealing Curtains, which for 1 black is a 0/4 wall at rare. It's got Defender, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to transform it, and you can activate it only as a sorcery. It transforms into Revealing Eye, an eye horror that's a 3/4 with Menace, and when it transforms, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a non-land card from it. If you do, that player discards that card, then draws a card. A 1-mana 0/4 really isn't worth playing, but one that does other stuff isn't bad. After all, it can block pretty early effectively, and this definitely does other stuff too, as it can become a 3/4 with Menace with an ability that can really disrupt your opponent. Because of how it's costed, sometimes you'll just play this as a 4-mana 3/4 with Menace with that ability, and that would be a really good card. And sure, your opponent does draw a replacement card, but chances are that the card you take is better than a random card off the top of their deck. You also have the option of not targeting anything if you think that's a bad idea, and it's nice that that's an option. I think this is a B overall. Next up, it's Courier Bat. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 2/2 bat at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you gained life this turn, you return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is a nice common. You know, it's a Windrake at worst, which is passable. And then, from the mid-game on, if you're in a life gain deck, you're going to be able to get a creature back reasonably often. Obviously, you're going to want some of that life gain stuff going on, and that's really going to be a thing in black-white. But there's enough life gain around that I think this will be pretty much an auto-include in most black decks, especially because it has such a good floor. If you just have like 2 or 3 ways to gain life, you're going to play Courier Bat. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Demonic Bargain, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. Exile the top 13 cards of your library, then search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, and then shuffle. Well, this is one of the worst limited cards we've seen in a long time. 3 mana for a tutor already, not a great card in limited, because you have to pay basically a big tax to search up whatever it is you want, and that's not going to be worth it for your typical card. You're basically paying 3 mana to draw 1 card, and even if it is a specific card, that's not a great rate. You're just replacing the card for a rather expensive cost. But this is even worse than a 3 mana tutor would be in limited, because it also exiles the top 13 cards of your library. So whatever it is, maybe you have a bomb that, sometimes maybe you run a tutor if you have an insane bomb that's unbeatable. Well, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you're going to exile that bomb from your deck and not even be able to search for it. And in addition to that, it also could get you pretty close to milling yourself. This is absolutely unplayable. It's an F. Next up, it's Desperate Farmer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 human peasant at common. It's got lifelink, and whenever another creature you control dies, it transforms into Desperate Farmer, which is a human knight that's a 4/3 with lifelink. So this starts out with an ugly stat line. A gray ogre with lifelink just isn't worth 3 mana, even in a color pair that has a life gain theme. But it has the ability to turn into a 4/3 with lifelink, which is obviously a pretty good rate. And transforming it isn't super hard. Something just has to die, so you can just play this card and offer a trade. You can exploit something to transform it. It seems like a solid playable to me. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Diregraph Scavenger, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 zombie bear at common. It's got Death Touch, and when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. If a creature card was exiled this way, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This looks solid. Death Touchers do tend to get a little less impressive the more mana you spend on them, because the fact they can trade with anything is less attractive when they're trading down, but the enter the battlefield ability here definitely does enough to make up for that. Draining your opponent 2 life with this will be fairly commonplace, and that means you get to hate on the opposing graveyard while also triggering your life gain stuff, and you're adding a pretty obnoxious creature to the board at the same time. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Doomed Dissenter, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 human at common, and when it dies, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This is a reprint, and it's a nice one to have in a set with the exploit mechanic. This is a great thing to sacrifice, and even apart from that, it can be a really obnoxious creature that just makes all X1s really sad since it just trades and gives you a 2/2. In the end, you get 3/3 stats out of this for only 2 mana in the end, and that's pretty nice. I'm giving it a C. It probably gets up to C+ in a deck that's really abusing exploit. Next up, it's Dread Fugue, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery. It has Cleave for 2 generic and a black. That's a new mechanic in this set that lets you ignore text that's in square brackets within the card's text. This card's text reads, target player reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it with mana value 2 or less. That player discards that card, and with mana value 2 or less is in square brackets. So neither side of this card is very good and limited. If you cast it normally, there's a good chance you're hitting nothing, and that means you basically just mulliganed, and the 3 mana effect is just Coercion, a card that generally isn't playable and limited. You've got to be adding to the board meaningfully in most limited formats, and this doesn't do that, and it will often do nothing in the late game. It gets a little better as a sideboard card when you know your opponent's holding on to cards and stuff like that, but it's an F as a main deck card and a D out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Dread Feast Demon, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 demon at rare. It's got flying, and at the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice a non-demon creature. If you do, create a token that's a copy of Dread Feast Demon. 7 mana for a 6/6 flyer isn't the greatest rate, but that's definitely a pretty big creature, and this one is really good because it cranks out copies of itself. It effectively turns a non-demon creature on your side of the table into a 6/6 flying demon every turn, including the turn you play it, and let's be real, that's almost always going to be upgrading your creatures. And stopping that from continuing to happen for your opponent is a pretty big challenge. So while I don't love the initial rate, the fact that it gets going on your instep the turn you play it is enough for this to get into the lower bomb range. By the end of your turn when you play it, you're going to have two 6/6 flying demons. And yeah, you had to give up a card, but it wasn't as good as your 6/6 flying demon. I can almost guarantee you that. This is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Dying to Serve, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare enchantment, and it says whenever you discard 1 or more cards, create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is a build around, and mostly for the black-red deck. This pairs really, really well with blood. If you can turn activating each of those into a 2/2 zombie token, you're going to feel pretty good about it. And really, you probably only need to get 2 out of this before you feel okay about the deal, and anything beyond that will feel incredible. The other decks in the format look less likely to have a critical mass of ways to discard cards, but as long as you have 7 or so ways to do it, you can probably play the service and have it be pretty good. It's probably an F in your typical limited deck, like if you have 3 cards that make you discard a card, you can't play this. But if you get up to 7 and higher than that, this can definitely be a nice value engine. I'm giving it a B if you can build around it. Next up, it's Edgars Awakening, which for 3 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. It says return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And when you discard Edgars Awakening, you can pay 1 black. And when you do, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So we see 5 mana spells that reanimate a thing from your graveyard a lot, and typically, they're nothing special. In this format, I don't see that being drastically different. The tricky thing is having something in your graveyard that's worth spending the 5 mana on. And if your deck doesn't have an incredible bomb or some impressive top curve, that's just not going to happen in a typical game of Limited. Now, the additional effect here definitely matters, as if you discard this to rummage with blood, you get a creature back to your hand for a single black mana, and that's going to feel pretty good. And so you sort of have 2 modes on this card, neither of which is like super exciting, but both can be good in the right situation. Both can get you back a creature from your graveyard that you really want, and that's the kind of thing that black decks do like doing in the later part of the game. I think overall this is a C+. Next up, it's Falcon of Wrath Purveyor, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 vampire at rare. It's got flying, it can't block, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you create a blood token, and you can pay 1 black and sacrifice 2 blood tokens to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is really good. A 3 mana 3/1 with flying that makes blood tokens when it hits the opponent is already really good, so adding the reanimation effect to this is awesome. And sure, not being able to block downgrades things a bit. It means you can't really use it to keep yourself alive, for example, but it still can continually pressure your opponent all game long. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Fell Stinger, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 zombie scorpion at uncommon. It's got Death Touch, it has Exploit. This is a returning mechanic in this set. I've mentioned it a few times, but I think this is actually the first time we've seen it in this video. And it lets you sacrifice a creature when this creature comes into play for some effect, and that can include this creature itself. And in this case, if this exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. This looks great to me. It's basically a black Mull Drifter, and that's good company to keep. Without Exploit, this is a card that always makes the cut. It has decent stats and the ability to trade with anything. With Exploit, it becomes a pretty high pick, as drawing 2 is pretty massive. Giving up 1 creature for that still has you come out ahead, and that's even more true if you sacrifice something ideal, like the guy who leaves a 2/2 zombie token behind. It can even sacrifice itself, of course, and sometimes that's worth doing. This might be the best uncommon in the set. It's definitely in the conversation. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Gift of Fangs, which for 1 black mana is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. It says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 as long as it's a vampire. Otherwise, it gets -2/-2. So this is a weird card. It's basically deadweight that has both vampire upside and downside, depending on what you're trying to do. If you really need to kill an opposing vampire, it will be frustrating that this can't do it. But if your deck has vampires in it, this is a deadweight that can also turn into an aura that can pump your creatures. And I kind of think all of that makes this have the same grade that dead weight would. There's definitely going to be some feel-bad moments where this can't kill things that wouldn't really happen with dead weight, but the additional flexibility I think is enough to make me want to give this a B-, which is what I would give dead weight. Next up, it's Gluttonous Guess, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 vampire at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a blood token, and whenever you sack a blood token, you gain 1 life. This is a decent common that slots in well into multiple black decks. It has high toughness, which black-green likes. It gains you life, which black-white likes, and it makes blood tokens, which black-red likes. Now, It doesn't exactly blow you away with what it does in any of those decks, but it's a solid card in all of them. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Graph Reaver, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/3 zombie warrior. At rare, it's got exploit, and whenever it exploits a creature, you destroy target planeswalker, and at the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to you. So in limited, the exploit here is pretty close to irrelevant. So what you're mostly looking at is a 2-mana 3/3 that does 1 to you every upkeep. If you play this on turn 2, it's pretty much guaranteed to be the largest thing on the board, but because limited is such a creature-heavy format, it's also pretty likely that he will be completely outclassed by turn 4 or so. So, it can trade up, and that's cool, but it doesn't really do a whole lot. It's mostly just, like I said, a 2-mana 3/3, and that's fine. The downside matters a little bit, but, it's mostly just this 2-mana 3/3. And while that's a solid card in limited, it's not amazing, and I think the downside is enough to bring this down to a C. Next up, it's Grisly Ritual, which for 5 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says destroy target creature or planeswalker and create 2 blood tokens. A 6-mana sorcery that kills a thing is not premium. It is unconditional, but it costs way too much mana. You almost always spend more mana than your opponent did on whatever you're killing, and that doesn't feel great, especially because you have to do it on your own turn. Still, it is unconditional and gives you a couple of blood tokens, so it isn't bad. Like if you have 1 mana hanging around after you use this, you can cash in one of those blood tokens, but it's one of these cards that's like a necessary evil when you don't get enough removal, but you kind of hope you get better removal than it. The blood does provide some synergy, and that's definitely important. I kind of think this gets to a C+. You really kind of hope you don't want more than 1 copy just because it's so expensive, and you kind of hope you get better removal, but I do think this does enough, and it's unconditional enough that C+ is about right. Next up, it's Grooms Finery, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and it gains an additional +0/+2 and has Death Touch, as long as an equipment named Bride's Gown is attached to a creature you control, and it has an equip cost for 2. So, this kind of equipment, 2 to play and 2 to equip for +2/+0 is something we see pretty often, and it's never that impressive. It can enable some attacks you didn't have before, but not pumping toughness is a big deal, because it doesn't help a creature survive combat any better. I gave a C- to the Bride's Gown earlier in the week, but I think this is actually a little worse because training isn't really a thing in black. I think that makes it a D+, and yes, if you get both together, they get better, but 1 copy of each is pretty far from guaranteed you'll get them both, and it isn't like they're great cards on their own, so I don't know how interested I am in jamming both of them into my deck in the first place. Next up, it's Headless Rider, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/1 zombie at rare. Whenever it or another non-token zombie you control dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. A 3-mana 3/1 that gives you a 2/2 when it dies is already a pretty nice card. That would probably at least be a B-. Getting a 2-for-1 out of it is very doable. The fact that this gives the ability to all of your non-token zombies is even better, and going to make it very hard for your opponent to interact with you if you're attacking or blocking. You're just going to get so much value. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Henrika Domnathi, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 1/3 legendary vampire at Mythic rare. She has flying, and she says at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose 1 that hasn't been chosen. And those options are, each player sacrifices a creature, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, and transform Henrika Domnathi. Once she transforms, she becomes Henrika Infernal Seer, a 3/4 flying, death touch, and lifelink. You can also pay 1 generic and 2 black, and each creature you control with flying, death touch, and or lifelink gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So, a 4-mana 1/3 with flying is a pretty dismal rate, but Henrika is going to be more than that pretty much every time you play her. You can choose to transform her immediately. After all, she's a great blocker when she's the Infernal Seer, and that means you're paying 4 mana for just the Infernal Seer side, which is pretty good. But because she can't attack right away anyway, sometimes you may want to choose one of the other 2 options first. Maybe that's a little greedy because as a 1/3 maybe it dies sooner, but ideally I think you choose one of these other options the first time around when she can't attack yet so that you get full value out of her. The draw option is probably the most appealing of the other 2 as it means you're getting a 2-for-1 at least. The Symmetrical Edict will only be good in specific situations. I think in an ideal world, you'll choose that option first and then the next turn transform her. Either way, you're getting a ton of value out of 4 mana, and while her ability may not pump that many things, it doesn't really matter, as her keywords are great and the ability to pump her own power is pretty nice. I think the flexibility here, coupled with the imposing creature she can be for the cost, is definitely enough for her to be a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Hero's Downfall, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. This was rare last time we saw it, and that goes a long way towards explaining how removal has gone back to being really good at lower rarities lately. And yeah, this is. It's strictly better than Murder, coming with the occasional upside of dealing with planeswalkers, and Murder's a great card. The double black in the cost is something that matters because it isn't as splashable as some other premium removal, but it's still incredibly good, and hard to not give a B+ to. Next up, it's Innocent Traveler, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 1/3 human at uncommon. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, any opponent may sacrifice a creature. If no one does, transform Innocent Traveler, and then it becomes Malicious Invader, a 3/3 vampire with flying that gets +2/+0 as long as an opponent controls a human. This is interesting. So you start out with a creature that is terrible on the vanilla test, but it can transform into a creature that does quite well on the vanilla test. I'm never a huge fan of cards like this that let the opponent make some decisions. If your opponent has expendable creatures, they'll just sacrifice them and keep this small. If they can handle Malicious Invader, they won't sacrifice, they'll just let it transform and it won't bother them. Now, there will be times where that decision is a pick your poison type thing, but you shouldn't expect that to always be the case. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Mind Leech Ghoul, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 zombie at common with exploit, and when it exploits a creature, each opponent exiles a card from their hand. This is a bear that has decent upside, as sometimes taking away a card from your opponent's hand will be worth losing the creature. It's nice the card is exiled because, graveyard stuff. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Parasitic Grasp, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. It has Cleave for 1 generic and 2 black, and it deals 3 damage to target human creature. You gain 3 life, and human is in square brackets. This is really good. There are a lot of humans who you can kill with this for only 2 mana, but in situations where you want to kill a non-human, paying an additional mana is perfectly fine. This is very easily premium removal. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Path of Peril, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It has Cleave for 4 generic, a white and a black, and it says destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less, and with mana value 2 or less is in square brackets. Wrath effects are incredibly powerful and not replaceable at all, so I do tend to like them in limited, even though they get worse in more aggressive decks. 6 mana for the Wrath effect is definitely costly, but the fact you can cast it earlier to take down some smaller creatures isn't too bad, though most limited decks won't exactly have a ton of cards with a mana value of 2 or less. I think the cost is high enough that this sweeper isn't quite a bomb, but it will obviously save you from situations that no other card can, but it's also pretty situational. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Persistent Specimen, which is a 1 black mana 1/1 skeleton at common, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Like many skeletons who came before it, the idea here is to recur this so that you can keep sacrificing it to stuff, especially exploit triggers. I think that really makes this a build around, as you don't want to play it at all in a deck that doesn't really take advantage of its recursion, as getting back a 1/1 over and over again just isn't very good if that's all you're doing. It's probably a D in your typical black deck, and a nice exploit enabler in blue-black, where I think it'll be a C. Next up, it's Pointed Discussion, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. You draw 2 cards, lose 2 life, then create a blood token. Black always gets a card draw spell like this, and the vast majority of them are pretty mediocre. Getting 2 cards for 3 mana and also paying 2 life will be something worth doing in grindier decks, and the blood upside is nice. You won't ever be playing this in more aggressive decks, though. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Ragged Recluse, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 human peasant at common. At the beginning of your instep, if you discarded a card this turn, you transform it. At which point it becomes Odious Witch, a 3/3 human warlock that when it attacks, defending player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This format has enough ways to discard, blood tokens in particular, that transforming this into a witch is very doable. And once you do, it's a pretty nice creature, although it isn't exactly a world beater. This is a C. Next up, it's Restless Bloodseeker, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 vampire at uncommon. It says at the beginning of your instep, if you gain life this turn, make a blood token. You can sack 2 blood tokens to transform it. Activate only as a sorcery. It becomes Blood-Soaked Reveler, a 3/3 that says at the beginning of your instep, if you gained life this turn, create a blood token, and you can pay 4 generic and a black, and each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Cranking out a few blood tokens a game is pretty nice, and that's usually what this will be able to do, and that's good because it can transform itself using that blood, and of course, you can also have blood from other sources too to help transform it. And once that happens, its ability can not only be a serious way to disrupt a race, It also means that all on its own, the Bloodseeker can gain you life and make more tokens. This looks like a very reasonable baseline and looks like it could be a pretty nice finisher once it transforms. It fits well in black-white life gain and black-red blood too, and it's nice that it's good in both. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Rot-Tide Gargantua, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 5/4 zombie kraken. At common, it's got exploit, and when it exploits a creature, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Sometimes the Edict effect here won't do anything, and when that's the case, it's just a 5 mana 5/4, which won't feel great. The upside is real, but I don't see this being very impressive in most situations, giving it a C. Next up, it's Skulking Killer, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/2 vampire assassin at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn, if that opponent controls no other creatures. The design here is interesting, and if you were able to trigger that into the battlefield ability consistently, it would be a B or a B+. Problem is, in games of limited, your opponent will frequently have more than a single creature. Even if you play this as early as possible, on turn 4, there's a good chance you won't be able to get value out of the ability, in which case you're talking about a 4 mana 4/2, which is not good at all. You can sort of try to set these situations up by offering trades or using removal, and it does get better the more removal you have, but I think the setup here is difficult enough, and you have so little control over it to some extent, that I don't think it's more than a C. When you do manage to trigger it, it's going to be amazing, but don't really count on that happening consistently. It's basically a D when it doesn't trigger and a B when it does, and that's kind of how we end up at a C here. Next up, it's Sorin the Mirthless, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a legendary planeswalker Sorin at Mythic Rare. It starts with 5 loyalty. His +1 lets you look at the top card of your library, and you can reveal that card and put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. He's got a -2 that creates a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink, and he's got a -7 that says he deals 13 damage to any target and you gain 13 life. This is a bomb planeswalker. Generally, for a planeswalker to get there, they need to have 2 of the following 3 things at a minimum: a way to protect themselves, a way to draw cards, or a way to kill stuff. And Sorin can do the first 2 of those, and he can even do the third one if he uses his ultimate. So that's what makes him really good. The 2/3 lifelink flying vampires are very real bodies, and the fact he starts at 4 loyalty means it will be challenging for your opponent to quickly take him down, regardless of which ability you use first. If you play this on turn 4, there's almost no way your opponent will win the game, and even in the mid to late game, he has a game-altering effect since drawing extra cards or making the extra bodies carries some real weight. This is an A. Next up, it's Toxrill the Corrosive, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 7/7 legendary slug horror at Mythic Rare, and it says at the beginning of your end step, put a slime counter on each creature you don't control. Creatures you don't control get -1/-1 for each slime counter on them. Whenever a creature you don't control with the slime counter on it dies, create a 1/1 black slug creature token, and you can pay a blue and a black and sacrifice a slug to draw a card. 7 mana is a lot, but Toxrill does more than enough to make it worth the mana. By the end of the turn you play it, your opponent's whole board will get -1/-1, and it's reasonably likely that will kill at least 1 creature, which will also net you a slug. This can be particularly true if you attack them that turn. Then, if Toxrill makes it to your next instep, it's pretty unlikely they'll be able to win, as -2/-2 is massive. The fact he can cash in the slugs for cards is pretty nice too, of course, but if you have no blue in your deck, this card's still going to be incredible. He can sacrifice himself in a pinch too, I guess, which is interesting. Keep in mind that if Toxrill goes down, the creatures will keep those slime counters, but they won't actually do anything unless you get Toxrill into play again. Still, I think Toxrill is a bomb. The fact that he affects the board immediately is very important. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Undead Butler, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/2 zombie at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, and when it dies, you may exile it, and when you do, you return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This is pretty nice because it sets stuff up in your graveyard, and it's also a great thing to exploit because you can sacrifice it to a creature with exploit and then get another creature back from your graveyard. And he actually does a fair bit for only 2 mana. It's not quite Gravedigger. Gravedigger costs 4, and it has an Into the Battlefield ability that returns a creature from your graveyard to your hand. And this costs half the mana and isn't quite as good because it doesn't have an Into the Battlefield trigger. And it's also not a 2/2, which would make it easier to get a 2-for-1 with. But if you're exploiting this, you're going to feel like you're getting a 2-for-1 out of it. And the fact it loads your graveyard is just great on top of that. I think this is a C+, and I could see him getting even higher. He probably is like a B- in a deck with a bunch of exploit, for example. Next up, it's Undying Malice, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. It says until end of turn, target creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. It seems like they give black an instant like this in every set these days, and they're almost always too situational and mediocre, especially if they don't provide a stats boost. I really miss supernatural stamina. But anyway, this does have some interesting applications in this set, especially alongside exploit. You can use it to rebuy a creature you were sacrificing to exploit, or to rebuy an exploit trigger because you use it on a creature that has exploit, and that seems like it might be worth doing. If you just have this in your deck as a way to save a creature from dying in combat or as a way to counter removal, it probably won't be worth it. But if you can use it that way and also take advantage of Enter the Battlefield and exploit in your deck, it seems serviceable. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Unhallowed Phalanx, which for 4 generic and a black is a 1/13. This is a card I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the toughness deck. A 1/13 zombie soldier at common, and it enters the battlefield tapped. So yeah, the idea here is that you'll play this in the Toughness Matters deck, and I think you'll play this there pretty much always, but you shouldn't be playing it anywhere else. Sure, it can block well, but a 1/13 just isn't that exciting. It won't be able to kill anything in combat, and the fact it can't block right away is brutal. Like, you're playing this card to block, and it comes into play tapped. There are some sweet combos to pull off with this, like sacrificing it to the flipped catapult creature, like I mentioned earlier, but I think this needs a build around because I think you just don't want to play it in any other deck. I think it's probably a D+ in your typical deck in the format, but a C if you're in black-green. Next up, it's Vampire's Kiss, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, create 2 blood tokens. I don't like cards like this. Sure, it alters the race a little bit and you get blood tokens, which the black-red deck is certainly interested in, but it just won't feel like this is giving you a full card of value very often. There are just lots of ways to make blood tokens where you're getting like a whole card and also a blood token, and this isn't one of them. It doesn't impact the board meaningfully. I guess if you have like all the blood payoffs in the world, maybe this makes it into your deck, but right now my impression is I just don't want to play this most of the time, giving it a D. Next up, it's Voldaren Bloodcaster, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 vampire wizard. At rare, it's got flying, and whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, you get a blood token. And whenever you create a blood token, you then check to see if you have 5 or more blood tokens, and if you do, this transforms into Bloodbat Summoner, a 3/3 vampire wizard with flying, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat creature with flying and haste in addition to its other types. So at worst, you have a 2-mana 2/1 flyer that makes a blood token when she dies, and that's something that would be at least a B-. I think you'd always play that in limited. At best, you'll be able to transform her and make her a much scarier creature with better stats who can also animate blood tokens. You can't really count on that happening super regularly. I mean, 5 is a lot of blood tokens, but it will occur sometimes, especially because her ability can churn out blood tokens when your other creatures die. I think overall she gets up to a B. I do think she'll just be too hard to successfully transform to be much higher than that. Alright, our last card is Wedding Security, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 vampire soldier at uncommon, and when it attacks you can sack a blood token, and if you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. This is a very nice blood payoff. Even if you can only trigger it once, chances are you'll feel pretty good, as this will be a 5/5 that gets you a 2-for-1 pretty easily. And if you have more blood and it can attack more, you'll really be doing it. It is likely that most black decks find 3 to 5 ways to make blood, so I don't really think this needs a build around grade, but obviously it does get even better in a deck where you have like 10 ways to make blood tokens. I think you can take this pretty highly. I'm giving it a B-. Well, those are my initial thoughts on all the black cards in Crimson Vow. I'll be back tomorrow to take a look at the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review coming out over the next several days, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications. If you want to catch up on some of my other videos, including more of this set review, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you enjoy my content and want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my content, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.